The razor wire war. Let me get straight into this, as I always do on this channel. The state of Texas is literally in a battle with the federal government over razor wire on the U.S. Mexican border. The federal government has won a decision by the Supreme Court to legally remove razor wire on the U.S. Mexican border, but Texas has invoked Article 1, Clause 3, essentially saying they are being invaded, thus we have the right to defend ourselves. Using razor wire is something you do to defend yourself. And to make things even more crazy, there are now a ton of governors who stand with Texas and are even willing to drive their own razor wire down to Texas to support them. So please stick with me in this video because this is getting really crazy as we talk about this razor wire war. Now, real quick, I don't have any sponsors on this channel, I only have you. Just please like the video or leave a comment or turn on your notifications. It helps me out a ton, but it also helps you out a lot to get the full story and all the facts that are currently happening on the border. Okay, so real quick, if you are unaware, the state of Texas has invoked their right to defend themselves utilizing their full state powers because according to Greg Abbott, they are literally being invaded. Now, according to Greg Abbott in the state of Texas, their statistics are stating that over 6 million illegal immigrants have crossed in through Texas over the last 3 years. And Texas is calling this an invasion. But more so that the federal government is not helping Texas in any way. If anything, they're actually getting in the way of Texas, and this is why Texas has essentially done what's called Article 1, Section 10, Clause 3, where they can protect themselves. Now, why are we talking about razor wire? Well, before Governor Abbott decided to invoke this clause, essentially the Supreme Court won a ruling where the federal government has the right to remove razor wire on certain portions of the U.S. and Mexican border. Now, of course, this razor wire was actually laid out by the National Guard, probably some combat engineers, which I was a former combat engineer. But according to the court's ruling, the federal government is saying that the razor wire is getting in the way of Homeland Security, thus they are not able to do their job. Now, I typically try to stay extremely non-biased and try to present the facts for you to come up with your own opinion. But as somebody who's worked with a ton of razor wire, and I'm probably the only person on the internet to ever go viral multiple times talking about razor wire, I'm going to go out on a limb and just call absolute crap. Razor wire is very dangerous and sharp, but you can literally just grab it and move it out of the way. So obviously something a little fishy is happening. Nonetheless, let us dig into the facts of what exactly is going on. Well, the Biden administration has been rather silent about all of this. Obviously, a lot of members who stand with Biden, as in like the Democrat Party, a lot of people are saying, Biden, you need to take active control of the National Guard out of Texas and put them under federal control so that Greg Abbott doesn't have control of them. And the National Guard is rather confusing. Ultimately, they do fall under the state. Greg Abbott is literally their commander-in-chief, just as the president is the commander-in-chief over the active military. But where things can get a little interesting is that technically, the federal government can activate the National Guard into an active status, pulling them away from a National Guard status or state status. Thus, the federal government can stand them down and tell them to stop. The only issue is for Biden, you might literally start a civil war between Texas and the federal government, so you don't want this to happen. But also, if the federal government tells the state National Guard of Texas to stop what they're doing, the National Guard can't protect Texas or the United States. So you can see where the federal government, or really the Biden administration, is very damned if they do or damned if they don't. One thing they do have going for them is that they won the official Supreme Court ruling of they have the right to remove razor wire. However, the states also have their rights, and according to Texas, they have the right to defend themselves and utilize all of their state entities to protect the state of Texas, thus using razor wire is being implemented to keep migrants out of the country, or Texas. Now, as it stands at the time of making this video, it's not like Greg Abbott and the National Guard, they're running rampant and telling Homeland to get out of here, we're controlling all of our border. As it stands, it's actually a very localized thing that's happening right now. It's at a place called Shelby Park. Essentially, there were clips of viral videos where the National Guard were pulling in migrants, or not pulling in, but they were allowing migrants to come in through razor wire or portals of entry and essentially processing these migrants, either allowing them to come into the country or kicking them out. This story is really being portrayed as it's the National Guard versus the federal government, who's going to win. And in some sense that's true, but in other senses the National Guard just wants to be able to do their job. Because if you're unaware, the National Guard most of the time is just standing in portions of the border and just allowing migrants to walk past them because they're not allowed to do anything because the federal government has jurisdiction over the state guard. And this was really also the main reason why Texas has invoked their right to protect themselves and say we are being invaded. So now the National Guard has full power to stop migrants from coming into the country. But this razor wire thing is interesting because, again, according to the federal government or the agents on the ground who belong under federal jurisdiction, their main complaint is, well, we can't do our job with the razor wire. Now, here's where things get interesting. There are a lot of governors who stand with Texas. I'll go ahead and name them off right now. Okay, so there are a lot of governors and states who stand with Texas, but the number is 24 as it stands. Here is a list of all of these governors and states. And again, as you can see, there are a lot of states and a lot of governors who want to show the United States that governors do have the right to control their National Guard and to control their borders. But there's one governor who really stands out and has already come out very publicly from South Dakota and said this: "I'll drive in more razor wire from South Dakota if I have to." What people forget is that governors are commanders-in-chief. We're responsible for the men and women of our National Guard. It's a heavy responsibility that weighs on our shoulders. And so we never engage our National Guard soldiers and those men and women unless it's incredibly important. And look, I think a majority of Americans stand by the system of having a National Guard. This is a way for our militiamen. That is why they have been created, for local militiamen to protect their states and not always rely on the active military to do the job. There is beauty behind actual Texans protecting Texas, or let's say maybe Florida does the same thing, Floridians protecting Florida. But again, the point being, over razor wire, there are governors who are stating we are willing to bring in the razor wire for you. Now, as a former combat engineer and somebody who's fixed many of razor wire and wired obstacles, how effective really is razor wire, and is it really that important? Well, to the state of Texas, and the way that they put it is that the use of razor wire, they really don't want it to harm migrants from coming into the country. They want migrants to come into the country, but legally. Razor wire is being used on the border, again, according to Texas, to deter migrants away from coming into the country. But again, this is very wishful thinking, considering a lot of these migrants, they're not all coming from Mexico. A lot of them are coming from around the world, from war-torn countries. Do you really think some razor wire in the way is going to stop somebody from coming into freedom? But to answer the question, how effective is razor wire, you literally could, if you wanted to, just walk right over it. It's been done and shown even as far back as World War I. But the way that the razor wire is being implemented on the border, and I've seen some images of it, and I've tried to geolocate and look into what the National Guard is doing, essentially, in many parts, they're doing something called an 11 row. Essentially, this is 11 rows of C-wire or razor wire, if you will, and it's actually meant to stop tracked vehicles or vehicles, where even if a tank goes over this concertina wire or razor wire, the tracks are going to get all coiled up and stop a tank. But in this case, it's also pretty devastating to humans, but again, if you wanted to, you could just go ahead and put some plywood over the razor wire and walk on over. Again, even demonstrated all the way back in World War I. But look, according to Texas, they don't want anyone hurt. They just want people to stay away from the razor wire, but nonetheless, migrants are still trying to walk through it and getting very injured coming into the country. Now, what I find rather interesting is there are senators and government officials who are saying we need to cut it out with the razor wire because we are injuring migrants. But I don't really want to talk about the devastating effects of razor wire or any sort of wired obstacle in this video because I have to go by the court ruling, which is it's getting in the way of Homeland Security to do their job. Now, I got news for anyone who wants to be a combat engineer or a military member who might work with some razor wire or wires in in general, it's not that hard to move out of the way. The only argument I can see that's a little valid or makes sense, like I said, an 11 row with razor wire, which are 11 razor wire coils stacked in 11 rows, and then you stack one more on top of all the 11 rows. This, again, like I said, is very devastating to vehicles. So maybe Homeland Security has some trouble getting around all of these razor wire obstacles because their vehicles are getting trapped. But nonetheless, again, it's very easy to just pick up a picket, which is anchoring everything down, or move some of the barbed wire, which is also anchoring down all these wired obstacles, and just remove it out of the way or replace that wire. For the federal government to ultimately just pick up all of that wire and get it out of the way, I think that's a very interesting move from the Biden administration and Homeland Security, because you are now opening up gaps to the border for migrants to keep walking on through into Texas and ultimately through the country. And look, again, without a doubt, there are migrants totally getting injured from the devastating effects of razor wire. It's literally knife blades coiled up in razor wire, but we cannot say this when the federal government's ruling was that the reason why they want to move the wire out of the way is for the purposes of Homeland Security to do their job, not because migrants are getting injured. So there's a lot of conflicting facts here. This little razor wire war, is the federal government really doing this to help Homeland Security, or is the federal government really doing this because, aha, we won, we have jurisdiction over you? Ultimately speaking, the Biden administration has to be extremely careful what they do in these next sequence of events or future events. Yes, could the Biden administration totally take control of the National Guard and uphold them into an active status and stand them down, or have the active military tell them what to do? They totally could, but again, this would be a very, very bad look for the federal government. Because ultimately, this undermines the use of the National Guard and the trust of the people who voted in these governors to protect the states. Because what this shows, and again, I am not a conspiracy theorist or trying to say we're getting into a civil war, but what this does show is that the president does have the ability to uphold his own military on the state level and utilize military members with actual arms and with actual gear and equipment to, at his own control. He now has his own local state militia militaries, and that's a very bad look. Now, I really want to point out the fact that as I look into what some governors are saying and others are saying, many of them agree that what's happening in Texas is extremely devastating and very difficult for any governor to deal with. But then you have another half of congressmen and governors who don't stand with Texas and don't see the legitimacy of what Texas is doing. I think this might be the first time in U.S. military history where a governor who has invoked his right to use his National Guard in terms of an invasion has come our way, get out of the way, federal government. This might be the first time in history where we have to bring in all the facts and evidence into a courtroom, and we really have to see whether or not Texas has some legitimate reason to call what is happening an invasion. To pull away some razor wire or other wired obstacles, I think it's actually extremely minuscule, and again, it does look like more of a dig into the state of Texas that, ultimately speaking, the federal government does control you. And I don't think Texas is getting really pissed off. And I think Texas knows that eliminating razor wire from certain points of the border, it's not the biggest deal ever, because ultimately you can just put some soldiers there. But what the biggest deal ever is, again, you're taking away the right from Texas to do their job. Again, the silver lining right now at the time of making this video is that Texas is really isolated to Shelby Park in the area of Eagle Pass, which is the epicenter for migrants coming into the country. The silver lining is it doesn't look like the National Guard is trying to really abuse their powers or really even be aggressive with the federal government. It just looks like they want to have control of a certain portal of entry that seems to have an influx of migrants, and the Texas National Guard now has the full power under Greg Abbott to do what they need to do with the migrants and not rely on the federal government. So they could just take them in and kick them out immediately. I have been seeing a lot of calls to a potential civil war, and I'm seeing a lot of calls that if Biden actually tries to go after the National Guard, maybe there's going to be some treason happening from National Guard members not listening to Biden. I am not seeing any evidence of that. Try to steer away from that. That's a lot of sensationalism and a lot of clickbait. Try to stick to the facts. Right now, what we're dealing with is literally razor wire. And it's one of those, haha, I can take the razor wire, and Texas is saying, okay, we'll just put some more in there. But again, the facts are this. The governor of South Dakota is already willing to say, we will send you some of our razor wire if the federal government takes yours away. And a lot of other governors and key leaders, to include the Speaker of the House, is saying, look, we stand by you. You have the legal right to do what you're doing. Just keep doing what you're doing and protect your state. So I don't want to keep rambling. We shall see what happens. But yes, this is literally the war for razor wire, as Texas is dealing with a mass influx of migrants currently, which again, they're calling it a legal invasion in terms of warfare. They have the right to do whatever they need to do to protect their state. The federal government is saying, we're going to take your razor wire. Let's see who takes the next shot. Will the Biden administration actually go out on a limb and take the razor wire? And will Texas just simply replace the razor wire? We shall see what happens.